This is the picket fence. It is a visual method to understand and determine the intercuspal positions, or the ICP contacts, between the maxillary and the mandibular teeth. In this video, we're going to learn more about this method to determine the ideal ICP contacts. There are three parts: learning how to draw the picket fence, anatomy of the picket fence, and example problems. Now, let's draw the picket fence. Step 1. Draw a 14 carbon chain, like the time you had to do so in organic chemistry. Make sure you have 13 lines in total. Step 2. Use 5 lines to draw the upper or maxillary arch, starting with the first crest. Step 3. Use 5 lines to draw the lower or mandibular arch, starting with the first points. Step 4. Label premolars and molar appropriately. Step 5. Add 2 arrows starting from the cusp of the maxillary premolar to the top right of the mandibular premolars. We will talk about these arrows shortly. The left side of the fence is the mesial end of the arch, and the right side of the fence is the distal end of the arch. One important point to keep in mind: make sure the lower arch is drawn toward the mesial end. Next, let's talk about the picket fence anatomy. So to understand the anatomy of the picket fence, we must take a look at its functional cusps. From the perspective of each arch, the peaks of the zigzag line represent the functional cusps. Therefore, the picket fence only shows the functional cusp of each tooth in the arch. It's important to keep the functional cusp in mind when we're looking at each arch, because the functional cusps of the mandibular and the maxillary arch are not the same. They are different. For the mandibular arch, the functional cusps are the buccal cusps. For the maxillary arch, the functional cusps are the lingual cusps. You may have already noticed that the picket fence is a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional structure, so it does not depict the functional and the non-functional cusps of each tooth very well. The picket fence is only a side view of the arches, thus we have to mentally visualize the buccal and the lingual cusps. The figure below the picket fence is the mesial view of the posterior teeth. In this view, we can see the lingual and buccal cusps more clearly. The functional cusps make contacts with each other, while the non-functional cusps do not. Combining these two figures, we can construct a three-dimensional structure in our mind as we are looking at the picket fence. The ability to perceive depth from a two-dimensional image will help you beyond this course. Knowing how the functional cusp works in the picket fence, we can start to explore the ICP contacts between the teeth. Let's take a closer look at the mandibular arch, with the buccal cusp as the functional cusp. As a general rule for the mandibular premolar contacts, the buccal cusp makes contacts with the marginal ridge of the maxillary premolars. For the mandibular molar contacts, the mesial buccal cusp makes contacts with the marginal ridge of the maxillary molar or premolar. The distal buccal cusp makes contacts with the central fossa of the maxillary molar. We're going to go over some examples. Let's take a look at the second premolar and the second molar of the mandible as examples. For the second premolars, the buccal cusp makes a contact with the distal marginal ridge of the first maxillary premolar and another contact with the mesial marginal ridge of the second maxillary premolar. For the second molar, the mesial buccal cusp makes a contact with the distal marginal ridge of the first maxillary molar and another contact with the mesial marginal ridge of the second maxillary molar. The distal buccal cusp makes contacts with the central fossa of the second maxillary molar. We can start to recognize a pattern here. A cusp would make either a marginal ridge contact or a central fossa contact. Moving on to the maxillary arch, with the lingual cusp as the functional cusp. The general pattern for premolar contacts predict the lingual cusp would have made contacts with the marginal ridge of the mandibular premolars. However, this is not the case. The maxillary premolar contacts are the exception. This exception is indicated by the red arrows. For the mandibular premolar contacts, the lingual cusp makes contacts with the distal fossa of the mandibular premolar. For the maxillary molar contacts, the mesial lingual cusp makes contacts with the central fossa of the mandibular molar, and the distal lingual cusp makes contacts with the marginal ridge of the mandibular molar. This pattern remains the same as the previous mandibular molar contacts. Let's take a look at the first premolar and the first molar of the maxilla as examples. For the first premolar, the lingual cusp makes contacts with the distal fossa of the first mandibular premolar. For the first molar, the mesial lingual cusp makes contacts with the central fossa of the first mandibular molar. The distal lingual cusp makes a contact with the distal marginal ridge of the first mandibular molar and make another contact with the mesial marginal ridge of the second mandibular molar. The rest of the contacts can be found in the table. Lastly, we will go over some example problems. Example question 1. Which structure of which tooth makes a contact with the mesial lingual or the ML cusp of tooth number 14? Before answering these questions, we should draw the picket fence first. Then, we can ask ourselves the following 3 questions. 1. What is the identity of tooth number 14? It is a first maxillary molar. Using this information, we can then number the other premolars and molars accordingly. 2. Is the ML cusp a functional or non-functional cusp? In this case, it is a functional cusp, which will make contacts with the opposing tooth. Non-functional cusps do not make contacts. 3. What are the opposing structure of tooth number 14? The opposing structure is only tooth number 19 in this case. With all of these information, we can conclude that the ML cusp of tooth number 14 makes contacts with the central fossa of tooth number 19. Example question 2. Which structures of which teeth makes a contact with the mesial buccal or the MB cusp of tooth number 31? Let's draw the picket fence again and ask the same 3 questions. 1. What is the identity of tooth number 31? It is a second mandibular molar. Even though this tooth is on the other side of the arch, we don't need to redraw the picket fence. We can still use the same drawing for both the left and the right side of the arch. 2. Is the MB cusp a functional or non-functional cusp? It is a functional cusp. 3. What are the opposing structure of tooth number 31? The opposing structures are tooth number 2 and tooth number 3. Finally, we can conclude that the MB cusp of tooth number 31 contacts the mesial marginal ridge of tooth number 2 and the distal marginal ridge of tooth number 3.